Hello and welcome to a Conquest, the last argument of King's battle report. In this game we're playing Spires versus City-States and the scenario is Breakout. This is the first of two battles that I will be reporting on that took place at a games day today in Canberra, where players are practicing for CanCon, which will be a World Series qualifier event taking place in Canberra in January 2024. First, let's look at the lists. So this is the Spires list that I played today and I'm thinking of playing at CanCon. It is radically different from my usual Old Dominion, but that's what I was looking for in an army, which I've been slowly working on. Now, kind of unfortunately, I won't be taking my own Spires to CanCon. It is all grossly tournament legal for official Parabellum events. At best, I might bring a few of my characters along since they are tournament legal, but I'm borrowing some armies from locals, and so this is what I'm thinking about playing. In this list, we are playing an Under Spire list, and it's trying to be a best of everything in Under Spire and early game Spires. It is very scenario aggressive. It tries to score early, maintain board presence early, play a game that takes advantage of that early pressure to inflict casualties on your opponent, and then conduct essentially like a fighting retreat or roll into the late game, not necessarily with an attritional advantage, but with a scenario advantage that it can at least maintain to victory. Under Spire is a very complicated army to play, and some of the pieces that I've chosen to add into this makes it more complicated still in terms of like moving parts and taking maximal advantage of the flexibility, but I think if I can learn it, it will be really good. So let's have a look at it. In our first warband, we have a High Clone Executor kitted out with all of the usual juice joining a Vanguard Clone Infiltrator unit. The only thing that's notable about him is, so the usual loadout for a High Clone Executor of this type is 160 points. He gets 3 mutations, which would usually be Infiltrator variant, Biotic Hive, and then Burrowing Parasites for AP1. I had 5 points spare, so I've exchanged Burrowing Parasites, which would give him AP1, with Adaptive Evolution, which will get him to Volley 4, and then probably also Clash 4 at some point during the game. This is a real toss-up, and if I needed to cut 5 points, I would happily downgrade to Burrowing Parasites to give him AP1, but I had the 5 points spare, and 2,000 out of 2,000 points looks nicer than 195 out of 2,000. And there are some cases, some edge cases, where +1 volley is a little better than +1 AP. There are some cases where +1 AP is better than +1 volley. The decider in the end was that in a lot of games, this unit is going to die, and the High Clone is going to go down fighting, so hey, I gave him Clash 4, through Adaptive Evolution, kind of as a for free bonus, but would be very happy with AP1 instead if I needed the 5 points. I hate 5-point increments in this game, they are what they are. The second High Clone, we're running 2 High Clones in this list, has just Cascading Degeneration, giving this big unit of Force-Grown Drones Aura of Death 4. This is a unit of 8 Force-Grown Drones, so with the High Clone Executor they will go to 9. If I had points, I would make this unit larger, but I'm cutting here and there, and basically there's not much left that can be cut to find 30 points to increase this unit up, so I am running it as basically this is the smallest I would run this. I would not run this unit any smaller. Ideally, you would also like to have Tactical 1 on the High Clone, and you could even, if it was possible, consider giving him more mutations. To do that, you would have to not take the High Clone Executor in the Vanguard clones, because you only have 1 copy of additional neural receptors in a list. But ideally, this guy would also have a whole bunch of stuff that makes him resilient to dueling, because the fact that he's not really that difficult to kill in a duel can take away Aura of Death from the Force-Grown Drones. But I'm not over-investing in this regiment, it's enough to be a bully early game and useful late game, and then potentially it will die. But by cutting it down to the point where it's not sort of like a pseudo Death Star, it's just, it's 240 points worth of Force-Grown Drones, that's not that many. It's 115 points worth of High Clone, that's not that much. It can still do a lot of the work that that regiment does, and of course has Regeneration 4 because this is Under Spire. The rest of this warband is a unit of 4 Marksmen. Again, I would love this to be 5, but you can only have so many points in a list. We then have an Avatar projection Pheromancer. I've experimented with one of the 2 Pheromancers being the Warlord, as in either of the 2 Pheromancers. This guy, I actually played a game where he was the Warlord in the Force-Grown Drones, but the fragility of that unit is just a little bit scary, so I popped it back to the Warlord Pheromancer being the Avatar projection, but he has no other mutations. He's in the unit of 4 Brute Drones, which takes that unit up to 5. The rest of the combat group is Stryx, and Brute Drones. Stryx are a regiment that I really, really like, but you will sometimes see versions of this list run fewer Stryx and more Onslaught Drones, because Onslaught Drones at 120 points are really kind of high value. They trade very well into like other equivalent sort of pleb mainstay stuff, particularly with Degeneration. The reason why I've gone for 2 Stryx in this list is that this list, because it runs the Vanguard clone Infiltrators, needs Stryx support Vanguard clone Infiltrators really, really well. This unit, like these 2 units, pair beautifully, and I wanted to have access, always have enough Stryx to be able to escort the VCI, and then a second unit for utility. Otherwise, brute drones in Under Spire are just good, they're beefy, they're medium, they regenerate, lovely. Finally, we have a Pheromancer in a unit of Force-grown drones. This unit can't score, obviously it's all light, but the drones just caddy the Pheromancer around and he does useful things. Then I get my third unit of brute drones. That puts the list at 10 brute drones. Again, if I had more points, I'd kind of like it to be 12 brute drones, but 10 is more than sufficient, given that I've got a lot of other stuff, including more range pressure than you would see in a standard version of this list. For visibility, the sort of like standard version of this list does not run this warband at all, and it uses those points to juice up this high clone, juice up this force-grown drone regiment, juice up these marksman clones to 5, and then add 2 more regiments in here, probably something like onslaught drones and more brute drones, possibly cutting this brute drone regiment down to 3 to fit that. When I went around and asked about how people were playing Under Spire, some very good players gave me the feedback of like that was what they were playing and considered to be the apex, and I think that list is excellent and probably also a little easier to play. I've set myself a challenge with this list, but I've also really enjoyed it in the few games that I have played. The first round of today's event, we're playing against city-states. Let's have a look at that list. So this is the city-states that I'm going to be playing against in this first game today. This is basically the current version of the list that Michael, one of our local city-states players, is playing. And he is continuing to try and use the Aristarch Warlord as sort of like a piece that is unique to how he plays. It's something that he finds that he likes. I would definitely, if you're new to city-states, just generally recommend a Polemarch Warlord instead. It's a less complicated, simpler, easier to use, sort of like overtly powerful Warlord trait, whereas the Aristarch really is all about like +1 speed at the right place in the right time is really cool, but Tenacious and +1 clash is probably better. Otherwise, what this list consists of is we have the Primodynamic Globe and Architects of the Cities 1 on the Aristarch. That's not going to matter in this matchup, but getting some interference into a list, particularly city-states who really want everything to survive, because it's kind of difficult for city-states. They don't have chaff pieces exactly. They have like certainly solid holding regiments, but they don't have chaff pieces. They want to play hammer and anvil and mobility, and nothing is expendable exactly. Having interference goes a really long way. We then have Minotaur Thyreans, right? So Hoplites, Minotaur Thyreans, there's your hammer and your anvil. The Hoplites have the upgrade that gives them relentless blows and a Minotaur, which puts them at fairly expensive, but like a reasonable blend of fight and hold. I think equally you could just like downgrade this regiment to just be Hoplites and not putting the whatever the Relentless Blows attachment is. It costs 25 points, but it's probably worthwhile to have it be able to do multiple things. Sort of your mileage may vary there. We then have an Eidolon in Thorakides with a Minotaur Thyrean. I like this unit a lot. It is expensive because the Eidolon is a whopping 120 points, but this regiment is, firstly, 2 things. It looks incredible. Like, it just looks like this awesome Super Friends band because you have the Thorakides, maybe with an officer in the command stack. Then to their left, you have the Eidolon, and to the right, you have the Thyrean auxiliary. It looks very cool. It's also a light regiment that can put out a variety, like it puts out a ton of attacks and high quality attacks, thanks to the 9 attack Eidolon, which is just whopping. And then the Minotaur Thyrean, 1 stand, giving you a whole bunch of cleave and line breaker. You get some impact attacks, you have fluid formation. The only thing that's holding it back is it's really, really damn expensive because of the Eidolon characters in Conquest are costed as kind of like a little bit of a tax. They have effectively 0 wounds because they die when their regiment dies. So this regiment, is it worth 450 or 350 points? Kind of. It's a light regiment that scores. It's very close to that, but it is just a little fragile. It's very cool though. It can do a lot of damage for a light regiment. You don't see many light regiments that fight this well. My Force-grown drones can fight effectively because of Aura of Death as a mutation, but they can't just charge and wipe something out, and this can do that. In watching the second round of today's event, I saw this unit go into a unit of an outsized unit of initiates and just annihilate it, and that's really cool to see. We then have a third warband, which is a Polemarch with Architects 3 Atlanta's Spear and Inscription of Lighter Alloys. Classic combination, right? Makes the Polemarch himself very dangerous, and then it lets the regiment that he's in potentially go a million miles, and yep, sure enough, he's in a unit of Agema. With fluid formation and whopping speed, possibly accelerated even further by the Aristarch Warlord, you can get these guys up to speed 9, I want to say, which is very, very fast when you also have fluid formation. We then have Minotaur Haspist. They're just good, totally serviceable. They combine nicely with the Aristarch Warlord. Once he's on the table, the Haspist can Vanguard up 21 inches, which can make for some great pressure, and they kind of fight okay. It's only 180 points for a regiment, so you can only expect so much. Then we have Saturoi, they have the Satyr Assassin in them, and Selenoi, which are the ranged unit. Now, reconstructing this list, I do think that you could probably make a couple of cuts. The Hyparchos, they're probably pronounced, the regiments, the character, the 25-point officers that for both the Agema and the Selenoi, I don't think they're in the Thorakides, but those officers are like okay, but I think you could cut them. Saturoi come in at 200 flat points normally, taking them up to 225 for just a couple of extra attacks and the ability to declare duels. I think that's the kind of upgrade that makes Saturoi more dangerous against someone that's unprepared for them, but not significantly more dangerous against someone who knows how to deal with them. And I would rather take a slight downgrade in the like punch down capability and have more points elsewhere. In fact, there are a few cuts you can make across this list that could translate into like an extra stand, or potentially even turning the Selenoi into another unit of Saturoi. Although I don't know how good 2 units of Saturoi is. 1 unit is very cool and puts some very interesting pressure out there, depending on what you're playing against. Some lists can handle them well, some lists can't. Your mileage may vary. Worst case scenario, they're a medium cleave Vanguard unit. So like that's not, by any stretch of the imagination, bad. It's just that if your opponent is prepared for them, you're not going to be able to use their unique capabilities as much. Overall, though, I do like this list. I think it's not playing the classical city-states hammer and anvil particularly much. You see that in the Hoplites and the Minotaur Thyreans, but the rest of the list is playing a mobility game. The Thorakides are a mobility piece, the Agema are a mobility piece, the Haspists are a mobility piece, and the Saturoi are absolutely a mobility piece, which is very cool. But I think, potentially you could make this a bit more of a classical list, you could trim things down. But I get why Michael is choosing not to play a hammer and anvil style game. And that's because some of the things that he has been playing against are just better than City States at playing hammer and anvil. Old Dominion, for example, which I played prolifically up until I switched over to Spires in the run up to January, are an army where everything is a hammer and an anvil if you run that sort of like heavy focus. And this list can't put quite enough scenario pressure out necessarily. It does help with the Thorakides. Maybe they can between the Thorakides and the Haspists, but it's a challenge for them to fight into the late game against Old Dominion. So they're not trying to. They're trying to play a mobility game that lets them get picks. So I like that as an adaptation. I think this is only partially leaning into that very classical hammer and anvil city-state strength, but if you can learn how to play it, and in particular, if you can make use of these how good these fluid formation units can be and the plays that they can operate on, it can go really well. Michael, however, has never played against my style of Spires. This was his first game against that, and we're going to see that kind of how that's going to play out. I think he's had 1 game against my Spires previously, and that was in a previous battle report, and I have accelerated the scenario pressure since then. So let's see how the game went. So a quick rundown of the scenario. We are playing Breakout, which is kind of Maelstrom with extra steps. It is, as far as I can tell based on reading the scenario, a scenario where you can score from the first round. There's wording in the scenario that says, on the first round, side zones are worth more, etc. But what we have is we have 3 zones up the middle of the table. However, unlike in Maelstrom, the central zone is contested by these 2 objectives. So you need to destroy one of them before you can score that zone. The side zones are worth 1 more point each on rounds 1 to 4 and 9 to 10, and the central zone is worth 2 more points on rounds 5 to 8. So my plan for this scenario was to aggressively contest the flanks and just make it so that it was a bit too difficult for my opponent to destroy the objective in the middle. If I made it challenging for them to destroy that objective, and therefore they didn't destroy that objective, whatever forces they put there wouldn't be able to score the scenario, and I would be able to lower my commitment on that side of the table, and in exchange focus on the flanks where I'm hopefully able to get picks and score kills. On this first turn, I had the dream turn where every single reinforcement roll succeeds. Spoiler alert, every single reinforcement roll will fail for the rest of the game after this. But when all of your lights turn up in this list, it's a lot of pressure early, and yet we can see that. Both of Michael's things have turned up, but because I have 3 characters coming onto the board, I'm able to just stall him out. I just have those as my first 3 cards, which means that he has to bring things on, and I can counter deploy perfectly. So for terrain, we have a garrison piece of terrain here that is otherwise impassable. We have 3 forests, 1 large and 2 small. We're playing these as hindering, obstructing, and obscuring, which means they block line of sight, halve shots, and reduce impact attacks, and inspired. And then we have a house, which is impassable, and then this little cornfield, which is just obscuring, not any other terrain keywords. So because Michael has had to deploy everything on the table before I have, he's deployed his Dorilates over here and his Selenoi over here, and I have counter-deployed. I've deployed my big unit of Force-Grown Drones with Aura of Death to fight the Dorilates. I'm very happy with that fight. I've deployed a unit of Stryx to screen for them and run interference. I've deployed my unit of Vanguard Clone Infiltrators here, where they can fight the Selenoi. That's a very good fight for them. And then I've got my unit of Stryx. Always support your Vanguard Clone Infiltrators with Stryx. The important thing about the Stryx is that they're all in this forest, which means that although the Selenoi can shoot them next turn, it's going to be a real challenge because obscuring will protect them. We've then got a pleb unit of Force-Grown Drones. If they hadn't turned up, I'd be happy, but as it is, they're going to run in this direction, go after the objective. And then we have the Pheromancer over here. He's just going to be a pocket Pheromancer for the Vanguard clones for now, potentially healing them or whatever over the course of the game. So round 2, Michael's Agema and Hoplites are going to turn up, and I'm going to fail every reserve roll, so only my Warlord and his Brute Drones will arrive. That's okay, I have enough pressure on the board. I've already scored at the end of the first round because those Vanguard Clone Infiltrators were able to get into this zone at the bottom of round 1, which has scored me some points. And so we're just going to push the scenario and continue to exert that sort of like gentle pressure forward. So a few things have happened here. One of the important things actually in terms of ordering my command stack is that Michael hasn't brought on his Saturoi, and so I'm able to cool, that's okay. I just need to be aware that they'll probably turn up next turn. So some movement has taken place. For example, these Force-Grown Drones have reformed and moved in this direction, just as preparation for Saturoi next turn, and I'm kind of getting ready for them as you need to do. Over here on the bottom flank, the Selenoi have fired into the Vanguard Clone Infiltrators, and then that damage has just been healed by the Pheromancer. And the Stryx have run into the Selenoi. They just run to engage. This is just a march, charge, and they've popped into melee. The Selenoi actually pulled back after shooting, but the Stryx have still gotten into range. The Vanguard Clone Infiltrators, who are obviously at the very bottom of the initiative after being healed, have moved forward, but they're moving forward. They reformed and sort of wheeled around. We got enough shots to be able to put down one stand of the Selenoi, but in particular what we're doing is we're trying to keep this obstruction between us and the Agema. Previous experience has shown that the Agema can reform and charge some absolutely extreme distances, and really all they need to do is just get the impact attacks, and they can potentially do a lot of damage to these VCI. So I'm just making it as challenging as possible for him to do that. If I had more stuff coming onto the board, I'd feel better about this, but we have some plans with regards to them. It's impossible for the Agema to yeet that far forward in the very first activation of a turn, because you have to have the Polemarch activate first, and even if you can put the Agema on the strat stack, but that takes an activation of the turn. So I'm not worried about. I've got plans to mitigate them potentially coming around and getting me. So I'm happy to get some pressure onto the Saturoi and set up the Stryx for a kill. Otherwise, it's just moving forward gently, right? These Force-Grown Drones don't need to go that far forward. They get into the zone. Michael, they activate very late in the turn, and so Michael has been careful not to rush these guys too far forward. If he had run them onto the objective, I would have happily march charged, having gotten +1 speed from the Pheromancer, so that we've got the Dorilates and the Force-Grown Drones in a big long line fighting together, because as soon as those Dorilates activate, they take 20 Aura of Death hits and just boom, explode. So, yep, no, totally alright with them being passive. This is the advantage I got from having so many characters in the list on the first turn. I got to counter-deploy Michael, and as a result, he's having to keep this unit back and not scoring with them, which kind of sucks for him. Ideally, they'd be facing off against the VCI, running into melee, and then doing all sorts of trouble, but because I deployed everything after he did, effectively, he doesn't have that option. The Hoplites and the Agema have moved on in the center, and this is playing into my plan. Even though the Agema are going to be be intensely mobile. Like, they could go wherever the hell they wanted, thanks to the speed that they can get. The Hoplites are committed here, and I'm fine with that. My plan is just to make their life miserable. I might kill them eventually, but I probably won't. But really, my only goal is to make it take as long and as agonizing a process as possible for them to kill this objective. Because as long as they don't kill that objective, they don't score this zone. And if they don't score this zone, I'm going to keep ticking up points on the left and the right. The Pheromancer has moved up. This is the Warlord Pheromancer over here. He's moving up just to support these things. And often I would get very aggressive with these Stryx, but in this particular case, there's no need to. If this was not a unit of Thorakides, I would happily run them into this gap. 20 inches, 22 if the Pheromancer buffed them. But this is a unit of Thorakides, and if I just swing the Stryx into this space, the Thorakides will just fluid formation and kill them. And yeah, lethal demise is a lovely rule, but I'm not throwing away Stryx just for lethal demise kills. So again, we're scoring 2 zones this turn. That's excellent in this scenario. More points tick up. We are establishing the lead that we are going to hope carries us into the late game. So turn 3, we can see that things have developed further. This is the turn that the Saturoi arrived. It's also the turn that Haspist came on. Thyreans did not arrive this turn. So I'm going to talk about some of the general stuff that's happened, and then a few specific maneuvers that were quite important. To note, in this turn, I once again had a big activation advantage, and I intended to use that in particular to deal with the problem of the Saturoi. So some basic stuff, the Stryx over here finish off the Selenoi. Boom, boom, thank you kindly. That's a combination of me clashing and then them clashing back and doing enough wounds that the lethal demise kills them. The important part of the turn, in particular in the very first turn, is remember that I said that the Agema can't yeet forward on the very first activation? So even though Michael won Supremacy, he couldn't have all of that happen very, very early. So these Force-Grown Drones, my very first activation, and they just ran through that gap. And this here pinched the Agema off. With the Agema pinched off, like, yes, they could charge into these Force-Grown Drones, but they were not going to get into the VCI. And if they couldn't get into the VCI, then the VCI would be free to act. And if the VCI were free to act, then they were free to react. And if they're free to react, they will annihilate any Saturoi that come onto this flank. Because of that, Micah was forced to bring the Saturoi onto this flank, and because I still had activation advantage, my brute drones were able to reform and charge them, and the Marksman Clones were then able to walk on, and between those two things, the Saturoi are dead. So the Saturoi had arrived here. They'd been pretty conservative, but with speed 7 on the brutes, with the Pheromancer's bonus, plus a full volley in effective range of the Marksman Clones, they just died. And that, like, that's kind of rough, but this is how you, if you have these tools, this is how you counter Saturoi. Not every army does. And although it's very tempting to say, surely the next 2 releases will be really good for city-states, for people who are playing city-states and struggling with them, I actually do think the next 2 releases will be very good for city-states, because there are really only 2 notable things that city-states don't yet have to access. The first is Clockwork Hoplites, which is just an absolutely premier regiment. It's just very, very good at doing punching. It fills the hammer and anvil in one unit role, which city-states otherwise do not have really on anything. But the other thing that city-states are getting is war chariots. And although, like, war chariots I don't think will necessarily be, in their own right, truly incredible, I do think they have one thing that they do that might be transformative. And that is that they are 80 or 90 point activations that are fast, scoring, and useful. And although city-states, when they arrive, still won't have a chaff unit, if you can take 2 chariots in a list, you can get a city-states list kind of easily to 11 or 12, maybe even 13 activations. And once you can do that, between that and the strat stack, you can start making plays early in the game that take advantage of activation advantage in the way that I'm doing right now with Spires. You can do things like delay your Saturoi, you can do things like delay your Agema and then launch a safe end of round lighter alloys assault across the table, because you have these early and mid-turn activations with the war chariots just yeeting around, doing some shooting, adding a little bit because they're going to be size 2, they can shoot over all of your infantry regiments. That's really nice. They provide fire support, and then you just have one of them who can just walk in and threaten a zone, which forces your opponent to commit a more expensive unit. So I do genuinely think war chariots, especially, although you will rarely see a game where it's like, oh my god, the war chariots do so much, the presence of war chariots is going to allow city-states to start taking advantage of things they currently struggle with. like they're struggling in this game right now with the activation disadvantage that they have. Thorakides have just continued to pull back and away, and so I've moved the Force-Grown drones forward to occupy the entire zone. Now if they get charged, yep, they'll certainly take a whole bunch of damage, but the Thorakides, if they charge them, will not be in the zone, so more points for me. Otherwise, the Minotaur Haspists move forward, the Agema positioned around this way. Kind of the Agema realized that, like, making this fight here and taking this charge was not going to be good for them. So the Haspist moved forward, and now that the Saturoi hadn't appeared on this flank, the Infiltrators were free to move up and around and actually take 2 stands off the Minotaur, which is bad for the Minotaurs. On this flank over here, the Stryx at the very end of the round as well, or at least after the Hoplites advanced, the Hoplites moved forward, and the Stryx just marched into the flank, because I'm just trying to be very annoying, like I said, and keep these Hoplites out of the fight. Getting engaged in the flank is going to make things particularly difficult for them, because it's challenging for them. They lose all their support attack, or they lose their support to rule. So now they're dealing with Stryx, and it may even take them multiple rounds to close that fight out. Once again, I'm occupying 2 zones, I score a whole bunch of points, things are looking quite good for Spires. The battle plan is effectively going completely according to plan. So turn 4, the Thyreans finally arrive, the city-state's army is now entirely here. I can no longer fail any more reinforcement rolls because my mediums turn up automatically, so the remaining 2 brute drone units arrive. But the damage, like the effect of my battle plan is, where I'm attempting to Horns of the Bull and contest these 2 zones, is basically progressing very, very well. It's going to be difficult for Michael really to pull like this scenario out, particularly given I can just keep throwing units into the breach and potentially even score some kills. Nevertheless, he does his best, and as we can sort of see, over here, these brute drones have just had to reorient and come back into the fight. That's totally okay. The Marksman Clones have moved forward and shot, I think, into some Hoplites. And over here, we finally have an engagement of the Hoplites, not Hoplites, Thorakides, who've actually gotten the jump on me. I've cracked back, done very little damage, and kind of just left that fight happening. Over here, the Stryx actually have been killed by the Hoplites, but we got a rule wrong in doing that. You can see here that this Minotaur Auxiliary has moved into the rear rank. The rule in question is that auxiliary stands, command stands, and characters all have to be in the front rank, which means a regiment that includes all 3 of those things must be 3 stands wide. We weren't sure exactly, like, was that a hard restriction, or was the requirement to be in the front rank only if you had enough space? Because to my knowledge, I think you can have like a cavalry standard bearer in a rear rank, because it's not a command stand. Not 100% on that, but like, so if I give Cataphracts a standard bearer, for example. But kind of neither here nor there. We got that rule wrong. They reformed, clashed, and killed the Stryx. Knowing now that they would not have been able to reform, I would have taken fewer attacks, blah blah blah, not by a huge margin. The Stryx would have lived, but not, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to materially impact the game. Otherwise, in the center, the Minotaur Haspist here has rallied and charged the Force-Grown drones. Doesn't really do any damage. I'm going to regenerate that back. And the Agema have moved over here. They have destroyed the Stryx, and then so the Stryx moved to block them. They charged the Stryx. You can see that they're now down 2 stands. That's from lethal demise. And then they have reformed into this position. And I've made a choice with the VCI here, where what I chose to do was I chose to reform them and shoot the Haspist to death to free the Force-Grown drones up to charge into the flank of the Hoplites. Now that the Hoplites were down, they disengaged themselves from the Stryx. If the Stryx had still been alive, probably wouldn't have done that. I would instead have just moved around and shot the Agema. But the reason why I chose to take that kill is I want to keep these Hoplites from ever being able to destroy this objective, and my brutes have finally arrived. Because my reinforcement line is a really long way forward, the brutes are able to set up here, which means that, look, next turn, if the Agema flank charge these guys, then yeah, look, they'll kill them, but I will just give them -1 defense with the Pheromancer, +1 attack to the brutes, and annihilate them back. It's a trade that I'm happy to make at this point because I'm far enough up, and I want to just keep anything from happening over here. On this side, we've already seen the Thorakides have engaged the Force-Grown drones. I've healed them up a little bit. I am continuing to rally the regiment, as I think I have to rally this regiment twice this round. They get broken when the Thorakides hit them, then they activate and rally, then they get broken when the Eidolon challenges the High Clone, then the High Clone rallies them. So they're not going to, I think they get healed slightly by the the Pheromancer is able to heal them, but only by one stand rather than potentially the two that they could have regenerated. But that's the price of doing business. Otherwise, we've got Brute Drones moving up here. The Archers move forward, and they take some plink shots, I think, into these Hoplites and don't really do anything. But once again, I'm going to score both zones. You can kind of sense a theme here, and the scenario lead that I am accruing is actually just becoming, I think we're very close to it being almost impossible to overcome. So this is not the final run of the game, but it is the last run I have pictures for, and we basically have a concession that happens shortly after this. In the center here, the Hoplites attack, but actually don't quite kill the Force-Grown Drones, Legends. In the bottom flank, as predicted, the Agema annihilate the Vanguard clone Infiltrators, and then are annihilated in turn by the Brutes and Pheromancer. Takes them out of the play, and it just leaves, I'm now totally securing this objective. And then up here, we have we actually had a pretty cool play from Michael where I'd activated these guys maybe kind of early, and I actually didn't want to kill these Hoplites, not Hoplites, Thorakides, because there's a unit of Thyreans here. And then Michael just calls my bluff, activates them, gets them annihilated by Aura of Death, and then immediately charges the Thyreans through using the commands, the strategic stack, and wipes out the Force-Grown Drones. But then they get charged by the Brute Drones and they get killed themselves. So, that's okay. This unit of Force-Grown Drones fought a pretty equivalently costed unit of Thorakides, and spent the whole game scoring points. So the Thorakides are dead, the Thyreans are dead, the Agema are dead. Literally all that is left is this one unit of Hoplites in the center, fighting off waves of just like little crappy things coming into their flank. And we could play this game out, but Michael still hasn't scored any points. He hasn't killed this objective. I've held both flank zones every turn for like multiple turns, and we actually just like, this is finished. This is finished. Even if the Hoplites could fight the entire world and Michael rolled perfectly for the entire rest of the game, the scenario lead is not recoverable. So we wrap the game up there. Now, having now seen how this has played out, I am not actually sure what I would do as the City-States player to overcome this. It's very challenging. I think there is probably a force concentration argument, where I think maybe he should have kept the Selenoi and the Thorakides together and supported them a little bit more, maybe bring the Haspist on early. But that's very what if. Effectively, from the beginning of the game, I had elements in play to shut down the Saturoi, and Michael actually said at the end of the game that playing against me has made him very good at using the Saturoi against everyone else. And the stories of them elsewhere in the meta are actually really beginning to like ramp up, where it's just like, these things killed my Warlord again, which is really, really cool. But at the moment, because I'm playing Spires, I just have a means of dealing with them. I have a means, because I have the Vanguard clone Infiltrators on one flank, and the Brute Drones and Marksman Clones, etc. on the other. And because I have just such an activation advantage in Conquest is absolutely not everything. But a bit like in Song of Ice and Fire, in the early game it can be decisive. And when you use that in the early game just to get kind of like picks and establish a little attritional advantage, you set the preconditions for a victory. And it gives you this really interesting kind of like theory of victory when you combine it with early scenario pressure. So am I enjoying Spires? Yes, a lot. They're very different from Old Dominion, and that contrast is wonderful. This was the first of 2 games played at today's event, and yes, I won very, very decisively. I'm kind of feeling sorry for Michael City-States at this stage. I am looking forward to the release of War Chariot so that he has a means of at least engaging with some of that activation advantage that I have. If there are any City-States players that watch this and have like commentary or feedback on how City-States can deal with this kind of scenario, I would be really interested in them, because I haven't figured out the answer yet. I've thought of a few things that can help, but it broadly feels pretty challenging. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this, as always, you can support me via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. Army lists will also be in the description. That concludes this video. Coming up next is going to be Spires versus Dwegom, which will be the nominal finals of today's practice game for the World Series event happening in CanCon in January. As always, I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.